Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm Amanda, and I'm here with my co-host.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Katie Crews.
And you've heard she just changed what she normally says.
Yes.
Do you want to update everybody on that?
Yes, we were talking about this earlier. I was like, the episode I did with Jonathan about marriage and communication, I introduced myself as Katie Elson, and I was like, I keep on forgetting. But I mentioned in the podcast I got married, so most people know.
Okay,
but
I
it's
just
official.
didn't know she told everybody. So Welcome, Dr. Crews.
Thank you.
And we're going to be talking about something I think all of us can learn from, even if we think we know about it. And I don't know if I should give it away right off the bat. Maybe I should just ask a question first, and then we could start with that.
Go for it.
So I know a lot of us have experienced this and felt this. What is resentment?
Yeah, so resentment comes actually from a French word. Some people may be listening that either know French or even if you know Spanish, and I don't know how to pronounce it in French, but it's resentir, right? Which if you know Spanish, it's also the same. Re means to do it again, and then sentir means to feel.
Oh.
And so it means to feel again and again.
Over and over again.
Specifically anger. So if we just break down the word, we know that resentment means to feel anger over and over and over again.
I like that, not because I like resentment, but I like understanding it that way because it sounds like something that we do to ourselves, which can be very painful to feel resentment over and over again.
Opening that wound over and over and over again when it's trying to heal.
Yeah. So what makes us feel resentment?
When different things have happened to us, it can be small things, it can be big things, it can be even bigger things like trauma.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what it is. It's the decision we make to hold on to it. And that we don't realize has a lot of negative effects on us.
Yeah, I think that's important too, to recognize that we're actually holding on to it. It's not somebody forcing it on us. So that means then that it could be something big, it could be something small, and sometimes those small things we make big. So, yeah.
And I've noticed, I've had clients who say, something happened to me 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and they're thinking about it all the time, or they're, holding on to that anger. And I think a lot of times it comes from a place of like thinking that they're punishing the other person by holding on to it. Or in some ways, some people even think that it's a bit like an addiction to hold on to that anger as a way to justify why they are stuck or justify why they can't move forward in life.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is, you can get a cactus, but you don't have to sit on it. So resentment is like sitting on your cactus over and over again.
Yeah, ouch.
It's not comfortable.
Yeah, and one thing that I like to help people understand when talking about resentment is, what are the effects? Like, what is sitting on the cactus? Like, how is it actually impacting me? Because it feels good. It feels like, I'm holding on to this for a good reason, but it's actually extremely damaging to you. So I want to talk about physically how it impacts us, psychologically, socially, and spiritually in all areas of our lives.
Yeah, let's go into that. So let's talk about physically. How does resentment affect us?
So one of the biggest ways is it affects our heart health. So I'm just going to mention some quick kind of studies that have been done, because it's really fascinating. We can talk in general about it, but here's an example. An anger outburst in the 2 hours after that occurs, the chance of having a heart attack doubles.
Oh, wow.
Like, that's an immediate effect. You have an anger outburst, the effect of anger on our heart causes so much stress on the heart that the risk of having a heart attack doubles.
So that's not the effect on the person who hurt you. It's the effect on you that you have a double chance of getting a heart attack.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is research has also distinguish between repressed anger, kind of repressed and like resentment versus like constructive anger, right? The Bible's
like
clear about
righteous
that.
indignation.
Exactly. So repressed anger, when you express it indirectly or you try to hold on to it, it's clearly associated.
Passive-aggressive.
Exactly. It's clearly associated with heart disease.
Oh, okay.
And we can think about, repressed, suppressed, resentment when you're holding on to it. It's a chronic effect. Anger outburst is immediate, 2 hours, but the repressed anger is constantly, chronically keeping your body in a state of stress that it can really damage the heart over time and create and be related to heart disease.
Can I tell you just how much this excites me being a therapist? I know you feel this probably too. How many people are going to their doctors wondering, why do I keep doing this? Medication isn't helping, or I think it's helping, but I have to keep taking it. And as a therapist, it's just such a beautiful thing to be like, I can help people with their heart problems.
Yeah, exactly. And we think about like, oh, your heart problems of like what you feel, but no, your literal heart.
Your literal physical heart problems.
Yes.
So
one other study showed that people who have like a personality trait kind of that are more prone to that anger are twice at risk for coronary disease.
Oh, wow.
So we see that it's like, okay, repressed, but not just a situation, but if you lean towards like holding on to that as almost like a trait of your character, it really damages your heart.
And we can change our character. So we're not doomed to it just because we're more prone to it.
Exactly. Now, the flip side to that is when they found like what they termed constructive anger is that there was no association with heart disease. And so constructive anger being really like focused on like something was done to me and I go to that person and I resolve it.
Conflict resolution.
Exactly. It's constructive. Like that anger motivates you to say, hey, I need to address this. And when we address it, we resolve it and there's no negative impact on our heart.
And so in that case, even that anger would be beneficial because it would preempt us to do something about it if we had that kind of anger.
Yeah, it's the whole idea behind be angry and do not sin, right? Anger, depending on what we do with it.
Yes.
And so really a lot of this is emphasizing anger outbursts, which is unhealthy from like an extreme explosion, or repressed anger that's not constructive.
Yeah.
What's also fascinating, so that's on heart health, is your lungs also receive damage when you have this sort of anger outburst or repressed anger and resentment. Just to kind of briefly talk about it, because we have other things to get to, but they saw that for people who harbored anger and resentment, that they would have a lower lung capacity. And one of the key components of that is they recognize that it leads to inflammation in the lungs, which we know is inflammation is a huge part of depression.
Precursor to everything, actually, not just the lungs.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. That's something you would never think of anger, right? Something that happens to me mentally or emotionally or psychologically is impacting even my lung health.
Yeah. So and I think it's cool that you're talking about coronary and lung, but that word inflammation affects every single part of our body, including our brains and stuff. So when we have that anger and that inflammation is building, it's the precursor to all disease.
Yeah. And that reminds me of, they've done research on anger and chronic pain, fibromyalgia, and other ones that are related to inflammation. And those individuals actually feel more pain because of the anger.
Yeah. So they need some therapy.
Yes. They need some therapy on their anger. And then in general, you can also imagine for inflammation is an impact on your immune system.
Yeah.
And so we can talk about generally, right? Like the impact of immune system, and the immune system impacts other, disease and so forth. And so we don't have the time to go through all of it. But
I'm thoroughly convinced on the physical.
Exactly. Like from head to toe, we are damaging our bodies.
Okay, let's talk about the mental. Is that one of the ones you're going to talk about?
So I think this is something that you can even speak to, Amanda, and just your experience with clients. Well, let me ask you that. Like, how have you seen it impact your clients mentally and psychologically?
Well, one of the big ways I've seen it impact them is just their ability to reason through from cause to effect. You know, well, they did this, and so I get to do this back to them. And I'm thinking, wow, you want to create even more of a problem by responding that way? Like, let's just sit back and think about this a little bit more. So it really affects their ability to clearly think through and process how to handle a situation.
Yeah, yeah. One thing, what's difficult about psychological problems is that they start accumulating very quickly. And so one research study showed that anger was correlated with higher anxiety symptoms. So especially those who already had generalized anxiety disorder, if they harbored anger, their anxiety symptoms grew worse.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like you already have struggles, and then if you add anger to it, it's being magnified.
Well, we talk about too, anger being a surface emotion. So anger often is like what you see on the top, but it has all these other things like anxiety, depression underneath it, abandonment, like neglect, that kind of stuff.
And, that's a good point too, because if it's at the surface and you keep on just staying at the surface, you're neglecting to address the underlying problems. And so that can, and research shows also that leads to further depression, further anxiety,
and even stop.
even insomnia. Like there are higher rates of insomnia in those who struggle with anger.
Well, and we know insomnia too can be caused by holding on to something and not processing it during the day. So then when you go to sleep at night, it's like, oh, now you'll listen to me and you'll pay attention to me.
Yeah.
And you will pay attention to nothing else but me all night long.
I just had a client this week who she's like, I can't let go of that anger towards, different things. And she can't fall asleep at night.
Yeah. Oh, so painful.
Yeah. I would say and this is the link between psychological and social, because our relationships are not apart from our psychological health, is the biggest impact. One of the biggest impacts is our social health, of impacting our relationships, both from the perspective of, leading to more isolation, withdrawal. Right? You see that in families all the time of something happened long ago and, well, I'm waiting for so-and-so to pick up the phone. And that person's saying, well, I'm waiting for them to pick up the phone.
Yeah.
And there's just this distance that's there that's not needed.
And anytime you're angry too, you're focusing, and I like to even amp it up to hyper-focusing on the wrongs of the world too.
Yeah.
So you're going to be more inclined to watch the news because I need something else to reinforce that anger, to validate why I'm so angry in the first place, which then validates why I don't want to be around anybody and I stay socially isolated.
And that starts like this spiral effect of, then we've talked about this in another episode of core beliefs, of you start creating this belief that people are bad, people are evil, people are out to get me and so forth. And so in general, not just in that moment with that person, but then the news and so forth, that I don't want to be around people.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, sometimes when we're hyper focused on the bad in the world, then the people that are right directly around us don't want to be around us because that's all we're talking about.
Yeah.
And research shows that relationships are built first on a sense of positivity, because that in essence is safety when you have positivity in your relationships. So when you're the negative, Debbie Downer person who's always pointing out the flaws in the world and in life, then you're not going to attract people, or you're going to attract the wrong people, which is even worse.
Yeah. And that reminded me too of when people are around you, but you're harboring anger and resentment, that inhibits mindfulness, being fully present in the moment. So you're holding on to something that's impacting your ability to be present with that person who didn't do something to you. And then that limits your own relationship with good, healthy people that haven't hurt you.
Yeah. Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear it anymore.
There's so many ways in which it affects us. But generally what we're trying to, really hone in on is the negative effects in many different areas. Also, one thing that we don't think about often is our spiritual life. So, Amanda, have you seen that at all with your clients? Or?
Oh, yeah. One of the biggest ways I see that is when we've been hurt by someone else and we've been holding on to that so long, we often attribute those same characteristics to God. Because who have I made God in my life but this person who's angry? So how can I see God as anybody but like that?
I know a lot of people they'll bring this up as a reason to forgive. They're like, oh, if you don't forgive, God won't forgive you, right? And it's often a very like a fear tactic of like, you have to forgive. But there's some truth in that. And we could talk more about what that verse actually means. But if we don't allow ourselves to fully experience the grace of God,
absolutely.
Right? And then that naturally motivates me to extend that to someone else. Let's kind of reverse it for a moment. Anger is like, I'm not extending to you. So it does become harder for me to receive it from God. Even if God is willing, there creates basically a barrier between myself and God because of a barrier I've placed between myself and others.
And it's a misbelief too. So it's like a clouding of my ability to see who God is. It's not him clouding himself. It's me taking that responsibility to generate these characteristics to God that aren't even there.
And I think too often we separate our relationship with God from our relationship with people. And so I can, hold this anger, resentment towards someone, and then I can have my relationship with God, and that's separate. I mean, the Bible's very clear about that of like, okay, if you have something against your brother and you're there going to worship God, you got to leave that, right?
Yeah, or whether you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto
me. And so the Bible doesn't have that separation, that treating others is how we treat God and so forth. And so that's going to naturally impact us, even if we're trying to keep those two separate.
That's a very communal view of our relationship with God. We were kind of talking about this earlier, and maybe you want to touch on that too, that communal aspect of it.
Yeah. So if you think about it, we're social beings, right? And being social beings, we cannot, just separate, our relationships or say, and this is why there's a lot of isolation with depression, anxieties. We try. But when we harbor resentment, we're going to talk more about like a lack of forgiveness. Then we're separating ourselves from that person and from the community by focusing on what is it that I need, right? I have been hurt, I've been damaged, and so I deserve to harbor that, but that also cuts me off from others.
Yeah, it's a very self-focused, egocentric way of looking at things. This is how it's affecting me, not how it's affecting everyone around me too.
Now, thinking about like, how do we start addressing this? Because it's like, I don't want those negative effects, right?
I'm still very self-focused. I don't want to hurt like that and deal with all those things. So what do we do?
We could take the approach of like anger management, right? But as you mentioned earlier, Amanda, of like, if we take more of a surface level, which is needed, and maybe we'll do a future episode on anger management specifically and deep breathing and all these different skills. But I want to go deeper, right? There's this image that I saw online of, it's like this iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg is outside the water. So that's what you see. And that's anger. We call it a secondary emotion. But underneath the water, as you mentioned, there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of rejection and so forth. And so to address the real problem, the primary emotions, especially that of hurt, one of the main antidotes for that, one of the main ways that we heal and we address the anger and resentment is forgiveness. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
And I think, you just reminded me of something too, that one of the things that we often forget is that anger is actually a protective emotion. Why do we get angry? Why do I need to be angry in this situation? Well, because I think somehow it's going to protect me from ever getting hurt again. If I come out and I'm violent and rageful and everything, like, well, you can't hurt me again. But if I just sit back and I deal with the stuff, well, oh, that's vulnerable. I don't want to be vulnerable, especially after I've been hurt. So our bodies and our brains often go to anger as a way to keep me from ever having to be in that place again and deal with that.
Especially if that's been modeled to you, right? If like anger is a big, powerful emotion, like protect yourself in this way. And it can be somewhat protective in a circumstance where maybe there is violence, maybe there is something that you need to fight back with. But as you mentioned, if it's actually the hurt and we don't want to be vulnerable, then we're never going to really resolve that underlying problem. And that's why forgiveness can feel icky, can feel like, oh, I don't want to do that because I want to protect myself. And so we're going to talk about a lot of different misconceptions of like basically what is forgiveness and what is it not. And one of those is like, forgiveness is weakness, right? It's being vulnerable in a way that I'm exposing myself to more danger. And so exploring the reasons why we don't forgive, but exploring the reasons why we need to forgive. It's necessary in order to allow our bodies and our minds to heal.
Yeah, and it feels so counterproductive, but in fact, it's like the best way to get there. Just like, exercising and breaking those, muscles and actually tearing the muscles is the only way you can build a muscle stuff. So let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Share some more.
So I would say, before we get into it, I just mentioned one of the barriers to forgiveness is not really knowing what it is. I think we talk about it. I think we have like a sense of what it is, but we have a lot of misconceptions.
And everybody seems to have a different definition of it too. That's one of the things that I've noticed. If I ask, what do you think forgiveness is? Well, I don't know. I think it's this, or, oh, I think it's this. Where do we even get those definitions from? So
and I think we have confidence in our definitions, but then those are often the misconceptions that keep us from forgiving. So we'll address that. And then the other barrier is, if you really think about it, in our American society today, forgiveness is very countercultural. And I actually want to start talking about that before we go into the main kind of subject matter, because and we won't talk about it too much, but it's helpful to realize that all the forces around us are trying to educate us against forgiveness. So when you're saying, where do we even get these from? A lot of it's society.
Oh, yeah. I've even noticed, usually I get these things from hearing my clients talk about them, but any movie nowadays, if somebody hurts you, there's no like forgiveness. It's all about like get revenge, like tear that person down, even kill them if that's necessary, because we've got to stop what is happening from ever happening again.
Yes. And there's something almost innate to us that like really cheers on that person, right? Of like, get the villain or get the person that, the oppressor. And I think it's because we have built in a sense of justice. And that's good. That's healthy. And I think that's God-given to us.
Yeah.
But how can we also seek justice through having a balance of justice and grace?
Yeah.
So if we overemphasize revenge and vengeance and hostility, anger, we're not recognizing the need for grace in what, if you think about it, we would like extended to us.
I think that's probably, too, our misunderstanding of even what justice means.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in culture, right, especially through media, it's constantly promoted, to have revenge and vengeance and justice without any consideration of mercy.
Yeah.
Right?
And we love to look at the villains or the perpetrators of these things as though they're like one-dimensional monsters. And that's one thing that I've noticed as I've watched society is we don't talk about, oh, what might have contributed to this person doing this act or anything like that. We talk about they're horrible, they're mean, and they need to be punished.
Yeah, and that is a big component of our culture today, the cancel culture and honor shame culture.
Yeah.
So what you're highlighting is we have created this culture of really honoring victims and really demeaning victimizers.
Yeah.
Right? To a point where it's so extreme that we feel like we are basically mandated and obligated to, elevate the victim. And if you go against that, you're canceled.
Oh, absolutely. And then what you're doing, and when you talked about separating them so far, is it's eliminating the awareness of like, I can be a perpetrator sometimes, or if I was under those certain conditions, I might do the same thing. So it separates us so much that we can't see the perpetrators in all of us. I've heard some people say that we all have an element of toxicity to us that we contribute to society.
And if you think about it, it's very black and white thinking, right? It's the extreme versions of like, I put certain people in one box, I put other people in others, and realizing that sometimes it can be gray. Now, sometimes there are situations that are very clear of that person is the victim, that person is the perpetrator, and so forth. But what we're talking about is the extreme culture that has really promoted these extreme categories of victim and victimizer or oppressor. And we honor. It's not just saying, okay, something bad happened, we honor the victim, which I think has made a lot of people then desiring and seeking to be a victim.
Yeah.
And then therefore,
because they get the attention and the
Exactly.
accolades like, oh, we're so sorry.
Yeah.
And even resources too.
yeah. And so that leads to, I don't want to forgive.
Mm-hmm.
I want to remain the victim.
Yeah.
And we, you can think about in therapy all the time, we talk about how to take them from victim to victor.
Yeah.
And there's even an episode on that.
Mm-hmm.
But if I am so honored and praised to be the victim, I never want to make that journey. So I'm stuck and I keep the oppressor stuck as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yep. Good stuff. Okay. So what's next?
Yeah. So we're going to talk about then what are these myths and what actually is forgiveness. And throughout, if I forget, remind me, Amanda, it's important to distinguish between forgiveness, pardon, and reconciliation. Those are different elements that often get combined. And so as we go through these different misconceptions, we'll define more and more what is forgiveness, what is pardon, and what is reconciliation.
Okay.
So the first kind of question that often people ask with forgiveness is does forgiveness mean that you're saying it's okay that it happens, right? And that's a barrier of like, if I think forgiveness means it's okay, I don't want to forgive. It's not okay.
Yeah.
So what would you say, Amanda, to like someone who's like, oh, I think forgiveness means you're saying that what happened was okay?
Well, I would definitely not agree with that belief because forgiveness doesn't mean, I would first say that how can I forgive somebody of something if I'm saying what they did was okay? There would be no need for forgiveness if it was okay. It has to be an offense in order for me to even call it forgiveness.
Yeah, exactly. So forgiveness is actually saying the opposite, that something happened that was not okay. Therefore, I need to extend something, right? Yeah. I like to think about, forgiveness also being a form of radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is not saying that something is okay. It's saying it happened. It's reality.
Acknowledging that it happened.
Yeah. And
we're not going to put it under the rug. We're going to say this actually happened.
Bring it out into the light. This is a skill specifically to DBT. But what it basically talks about is you cause yourself more suffering by rejecting the reality, by holding on to something over and over again. And so forgiveness is a form of radical acceptance to say, it happened.
Yeah.
I realize it happened and I want to let go of it so that I can move forward in that.
And not stay stuck.
Yeah. And so it's not that it's okay, it's realizing it's not okay, but I want to channel my anger away from that person and from that incident and then kind of heal from that and be able to move forward.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, another kind of misconception is, that forgiveness requires forgetting.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I recognize it's not okay, but people are telling me that I have to forget.
And sometimes the perpetrator will even say, well, you need to forget about this.
Exactly. Now, is that even possible?
Not me. I mean, I'd love to have a frontal lobotomy and be able to forget all of the things.
Zap it. But it's not even possible. So this misconception comes from this idea of feeling pressured that healing requires forgetting. So what then, how does healing look like then? How does forgiveness help us move forward while not forgetting?
Yeah. Are you asking me?
It was like one of those questions that either you can answer or I can start answering.
Well, I think in remembering, one of the benefits of remembering something is I learn from it, I grow from it, and I can adjust the things I do in the future based on what happened this time. So for me, when I think about remembering something, I don't remember it to just let it be something I keep pounding every single day at. It's something that I look at and I go, okay, what would I like to do differently next time? Or how would I like to respond to this differently because it's still affecting me? So what could I do, differently? Yeah.
So this made me think about, in the case of trauma, right, is trauma when we have PTSD and complex PTSD and a lot of kind of current symptoms that are basically, it's really hard to forget what happened.
Yeah.
One thing I tell my clients is, it's not forgetting, it's just remembering that it's let's say, chapter 2 of your story. So it doesn't mean that you have to relive it over and over again. And that's what resentment is. And that's the lack of forgiveness.
I don't have to read chapter 2 over and over again. I can move on to chapter 3.
You're like writing your chapter, let's say 40 something, and you're still writing about the same thing. And it's like, no, you can put it in the past. It's like burying something. You like, it happened, it's there, but it doesn't have to be my present.
Yeah.
And I love a quote from the book Amish Grace, which I'll probably quote more throughout. It's an excellent book that if anyone or everyone actually should read, because we'll talk about it later.
We both recommend this book heavily.
Highly, yeah. So it says, forgiveness is less a matter of forgive and forget than of forgive and remember. Remembering in ways that bring healing. When we remember, we take the broken pieces of our lives that have been dismembered by tragedy and injustice, and remember them into something whole. And I just love that, because it's like, okay, it's chapter 2 of your story. And how do you remember it in a way that you bring your whole story together? You're not saying, oh, I'm trying to forget it. It didn't happen. No, it happened. And that's also kind of the idea behind post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, I was just going to say grit. This is the whole idea with grit, is we go through it, but we learn and we process it and we get better from it.
Yeah. So just thinking about, it's not about forgetting. It's about remembering intentionally in a way that you're not reliving it constantly, but you're moving forward with now it being a part of your story that has shaped you into a better person, a more resilient person.
Yeah. Well, this would probably be a good place to stop, and then we'll do a part 2.
Yes.
We've just decided we're going to make this part 2 because there's so much good stuff that we want to talk about. So we'll end this here, and you'll have to come back for part 2. Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.